The tourist had always dreamed of visiting the Grand Royal Palace. It wasn't just a place of beauty. It was a symbol of the country's rich history, its deep-rooted traditions, and the power of its royal family. He had seen it in photos and documentaries, and now, finally, he was standing in front of it. His heart raced with excitement as he took in the sight of the towering gates, the majestic architecture, and the lush gardens surrounding the palace grounds. Everything about it screamed royalty, and he couldn't wait to explore every inch of it. It was early in the morning when he arrived, and the air was cool, the sky clear and blue. The streets were quiet, and there was a certain calmness in the atmosphere. As the tourist wandered through the palace courtyard, he felt as though he had stepped into another world. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the open spaces, and he marveled at the sight of the tall stone walls that seemed to tell stories of ancient times. He wasn't the only one taking in the view. A few other tourists were walking around, taking photographs, and soaking in the beauty of the place. But what really caught his attention were the royal guards. Positioned around the palace, they stood as still as statues, their uniforms pristine and perfectly pressed. They wore dark uniforms with shiny breastplates, tall hats, and boots that gleamed in the sunlight. Their faces were expressionless, and they stood at attention with their rifles held firmly at their sides. It was impossible not to notice them. They were an integral part of the palace's aura of power and authority. The tourist couldn't help but be intrigued by them. They looked so serious, so disciplined. He had read about royal guards in history books and seen them in movies, but seeing them in person was an entirely different experience. It was like being in the presence of something far beyond ordinary. It made him feel both excited and a little nervous. He knew that these guards were not to be messed with. They were trained to protect the royal family, and they took their job seriously. He had heard stories about tourists who tried to get too close to the guards or even attempted to take photos with them. Most of the time, these tourists were scolded or told to keep their distance, but he never imagined that doing something like that could have serious consequences. In the back of his mind, he thought that he'd have to be careful, but his curiosity outweighed any caution. As he continued to walk through the courtyard, he spotted one of the guards standing near the entrance. This particular guard stood a little to the side, watching over the area with unwavering focus. The tourist couldn't resist. He wanted to get a closer look at him. His heart pounded a little faster as he approached, careful to stay on the path and keep a respectful distance. The guard didn't move a muscle, his gaze fixed forward as if nothing could distract him. The tourist stopped a few feet away, adjusting the lens on his camera, hoping to get a clear shot of the guard's striking uniform and stoic posture. He stepped back a little, trying to find the best angle for the perfect photo. He marveled at how disciplined the guard appeared, how everything about him was so controlled and methodical. It was almost as if the guard had become one with the palace itself. The tourist snapped a few quick pictures, but something inside him felt the need to do more. He had always been the type of person to push boundaries, to test limits, and today, for some reason, he felt a strange urge to do the same. Without thinking much about the consequences, he took a few steps closer. The guard's stillness was mesmerizing, and the tourist wondered if he could provoke any reaction at all. He had seen videos online where tourists managed to get guards to break their composure with silly gestures or playful antics. It seemed harmless, just a bit of fun to make the experience more memorable. The tourist stood beside the guard, carefully observing his face, trying to gauge any sign of emotion. But the guard didn't budge. His eyes remained fixed ahead, unwavering. The tourist looked around quickly, making sure no one was watching too closely. It was a moment of impulse, a decision that would change everything. With a grin on his face, the tourist lightly tapped the guard's back. It was only a quick, playful slap, nothing meant to cause harm, just a joke. But as soon as his hand made contact with the guard's uniform, everything changed. The guard's posture remained still for a split second, but there was something in the air that shifted. The tourist realized, a moment too late, that he had crossed an invisible line. The air grew thick with tension, and it didn't take long for the sound of footsteps to approach quickly. Before he could even think about moving, security personnel rushed toward him, their expressions stern and urgent. The tourist's heart skipped a beat. He had never imagined that his little joke, his playful gesture, could lead to something like this. The friendly atmosphere around the palace instantly turned into something much more serious, and the weight of the situation began to dawn on him. What he had done was far from harmless. It was a serious breach of the country's customs and laws. The tourist tried to explain himself, offering apologies, but the stern faces of the guards and palace staff made it clear that no words would undo what had just happened. The joke he had meant as a way to make his visit more memorable now felt like a terrible mistake, and the consequences of his impulsive act were about to unfold in a way he could never have predicted. The moment the tourist felt the tap on his back, he thought it would be nothing more than a harmless interaction. He didn't expect much of a response from the guard. After all, the guard hadn't even moved or acknowledged him when he'd stood so close. It was just a joke, a small act to break the stillness, to make the moment feel a little more memorable. But as soon as his hand made contact with the guard, something changed. The tourist's heart skipped a beat as the sound of heavy footsteps approached from behind him. He hadn't heard anyone coming, and suddenly, there were two palace security guards standing at his side. Their expressions were serious, their eyes cold with disapproval. He immediately felt a knot form in his stomach. He hadn't expected any reaction, let alone one that made him feel so intensely aware of his mistake. "Excuse me, sir, we need you to come with us," one of the guards said, his voice firm but calm. The tourist opened his mouth to protest, to explain that it had all been just a joke. He didn't mean any harm, not in the slightest. But before he could get the words out, the second guard stepped forward, blocking his path. The tension in the air was thick. The tourist glanced around, hoping to see other people laughing, maybe giving him a sign that it was all just part of a fun interaction. But no one was laughing. In fact, the few tourists who were near the entrance had stopped what they were doing and were watching quietly, some of them even pulling out their phones to record the scene. The sudden attention from the other visitors made his heart race even faster. The guards didn't seem to be interested in any of his apologies. They didn't respond when he tried to explain that it was a harmless mistake. One of the security guards simply nodded at the other, signaling that they should escort him to a more private area. The tourist tried to walk calmly, though his mind was racing with confusion. What was happening? How could a simple, playful gesture turn into something so serious? As they led him away from the main courtyard, the tourist's thoughts were jumbled. He had visited many places before, and while he understood the importance of respecting local customs, he hadn't realized how serious this particular tradition was. The royal guards were not just symbols of power, they were deeply respected, even revered, by the people. He had read about the royal family and their significance to the nation, but somehow, he never fully grasped just how much respect was expected when it came to their traditions and practices. The guards didn't speak as they guided him through a back corridor, away from the public eye. The tourist tried to make light of the situation, cracking a nervous smile and asking if they were really going to make a big deal out of a slap on the back. But the two guards remained silent, their faces unreadable. The silence only made the tourist more uneasy. He began to realize that this wasn't something to joke about. When they reached a small plain room at the back of the palace grounds, the guards motioned for him to sit on a wooden chair. The tourist reluctantly obeyed, still feeling the rush of adrenaline in his veins. What was happening? Were they really going to punish him for something so small? It was just a tap, a playful gesture, nothing more. His mind raced as he wondered if there was a way to make this right. He offered another apology, this time more sincere, but the guards didn't respond. They simply stood at the door, watching him closely, as though waiting for something. The tourist tried to steady his breathing, hoping that the situation would blow over. But as time passed and no one spoke, his nerves began to fray. He couldn't help but wonder if he was going to end up in trouble. He tried to remember if he had seen anything about a punishment for disrespecting the guards during his travels. He racked his brain but couldn't think of any warnings that had specifically mentioned how seriously the country took offenses like this. What felt like hours passed before someone else arrived. A middle-aged man dressed in a uniform that indicated he held a higher rank. The man looked the tourist up and down with a calm but stern expression. Without introducing himself, the man sat down in the chair across from him and simply stared at him for a long moment. The silence between them was heavy, and the tourist shifted uneasily in his seat. Finally, the man spoke. "You understand the gravity of your actions, correct?" His voice was firm, but there was no anger behind it, just a straightforward question. The tourist, now more than a little frightened, nodded quickly. He wanted to explain, to make the man understand that it had been a mistake, that he hadn't meant any harm. But words seemed to fail him at that moment. "I didn't know," the tourist said, his voice shaking a little. "I didn't know it would be taken so seriously. It was just a joke." The man nodded slowly, his expression softening slightly. "It is no small thing to disrespect our royal guards. They are not simply soldiers. They are symbols of our people's strength and honor. To touch one without permission is an insult, and it cannot be overlooked." The tourist swallowed hard, realizing just how deeply rooted the guard's role was in the country's culture. The realization hit him like a wave. This wasn't just a minor slip-up. It was an act that defied a core part of the country's identity. The man continued to look at him intently, waiting for the tourist to understand the seriousness of his mistake. "I understand," the tourist said quietly, now fully aware that his actions had consequences beyond what he could have imagined. As the man turned to leave, he felt a chill in his bones. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his joke would lead to something far worse than he had ever expected. The tourist sat quietly, his mind racing. The man who had spoken to him had left the room moments ago, and now he was left alone with his thoughts. He couldn't help but feel a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. Every part of his body felt tense. What had seemed like a harmless, playful action now felt like a huge mistake, one that was beginning to spiral out of control. The room he was in was small and stark, with little more than a wooden table and a few chairs scattered around. The walls were bare, and there was a small window that let in just enough light for him to see clearly. The sounds of the bustling palace outside had disappeared, leaving him in a strange, quiet isolation. The silence felt oppressive, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had never been in trouble like this before. Sure, there were minor misunderstandings during his travels, small cultural differences he had overlooked or not fully understood. But this was something completely different. He had never imagined that a simple joke could lead to being detained in a foreign country, let alone facing serious legal consequences. The severity of the situation was slowly sinking in, and he found himself wishing he had never stepped foot near the royal guards in the first place. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear to him that this wasn't just about his slap. It was about something much deeper: respect for the traditions, the culture, and the history of the country. The royal guards were more than just soldiers. They were a living representation of the nation's pride and identity. He had crossed a line by disrespecting them, and now he was paying the price. His thoughts were interrupted when the door opened again, and a few more people entered the room. This time, it wasn't just one man. There were two more individuals, dressed in dark suits, their faces serious and unreadable. One of them stepped forward and sat down at the table across from him. The other stood near the door, arms crossed, watching him carefully. The atmosphere in the room became even more tense. The man who had sat down in front of him spoke first, his tone calm but firm. "You've caused quite a stir, you know," he said. "The guards have informed us of what happened, and now we need to determine how to proceed." The tourist's heart began to race again. He opened his mouth, But no words came out. He had so many things to say, so many reasons why he had acted the way he did. But none of it seemed to matter now. He had crossed a boundary, and the consequences were unfolding quickly. He swallowed hard, trying to calm his nerves. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he finally managed to say. "It was just supposed to be a funny moment. I didn't know it would be such a big deal." He hoped they would understand, that they would see his side of things. But as he spoke, he could see in their eyes that this wasn't just about the intent behind his actions. It was about the respect that he had failed to show. The man sitting across from him didn't respond immediately. Instead, he picked up a small notebook from the table and began to flip through its pages. The tourist tried not to fidget, trying his best to maintain his composure, but it was difficult. His mind was still reeling from the shock of it all. He had read about strict laws and cultural practices in different countries, but this felt like something out of a movie. He never imagined that a simple touch, a tap on the back, could lead to a life-changing moment. As the man flipped through the pages of his notebook, the tourist's thoughts wandered. He had come here to explore, to experience something new. The royal palace, with its grandeur and beauty, had seemed like the perfect destination. But now it was the source of his biggest mistake. He had only been trying to get a closer look at the guards, to see the discipline that had fascinated him for so long. But in doing so, he had misjudged the situation entirely. When the man looked up from his notebook, the tourist's heart skipped a beat. The expression on his face had softened slightly, but it was still serious. "We understand that you didn't know the full extent of the consequences," he said. "But now that you're here, we need to make sure that this situation is handled properly." The tourist nodded quickly, hoping that somehow they might let him go with just a warning. Perhaps they would see that he had not acted out of malice or disrespect, but rather out of ignorance. But he had no idea what would happen next. The man continued, his words firm and resolute. "You have disrespected one of the country's most sacred traditions, and that is not something we can ignore. We cannot simply let this go." The tourist felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. His body felt heavy, as though the walls of the room were closing in on him. He had been warned in passing by other travelers about the importance of understanding the culture before visiting, but no one had ever told him that something so small could have such a big impact. The two men exchanged a brief glance, and the one who had been writing in the notebook stood up. "We will need to report this to the authorities," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "You will be held in custody until the matter is sorted out." The tourist's mind raced. He tried to imagine how he could get out of this, how he could fix the mistake he had made. But the more he thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. He wasn't sure if there was any way to make things right now. The consequences were unfolding too quickly, and he was caught in a situation he hadn't prepared for. He felt a deep sense of regret. If only he had known the rules better, had understood the seriousness of the traditions that governed this place. He wished he could go back and undo the slap, erase the mistake. But he knew it was too late for that. The path ahead was uncertain, and as he sat there, waiting for what would happen next, he couldn't help but feel that his dream of a peaceful visit had just turned into a nightmare. Time seemed to slow down as the tourist sat in the small, quiet room. The walls, which had once felt neutral and simple, now seemed like they were closing in on him. The door had been shut behind him, and the muffled sound of footsteps outside was the only noise that filled the space. His mind raced, his thoughts bouncing from one possibility to the next. What could he possibly do now? What would happen to him? The officers who had entered earlier had left, but the atmosphere in the room was still thick with tension. The air felt heavy, and every minute that passed seemed to stretch longer than the last. His heart was pounding in his chest, and it felt like it was the only thing he could hear. He hadn't expected his trip to take such a turn. The excitement he had felt just hours ago, when he had first laid eyes on the palace, was now a distant memory. He had been so excited to see the royal guards, to witness their discipline and dedication firsthand. But now he was locked away in this room, waiting for what would come next. It wasn't long before the door creaked open again, this time with more urgency. Two new figures entered, both of them wearing serious expressions. They were dressed in uniforms that looked slightly more official than the ones worn by the guards and officers he had encountered earlier. One of them, a tall man with dark hair, stepped forward and gave him a measured look. The other, shorter and with glasses, stood back by the door, seemingly observing everything quietly. "Are you ready to speak with us?" The tall man asked in a voice that, while polite, had an unmistakable firmness to it. It wasn't an offer, it was a command. The tourist opened his mouth to speak, but found that his throat felt dry. He nodded quickly, afraid that if he said anything, he might make the situation worse. He had already caused enough trouble, hadn't he? He had acted impulsively, without thinking about the consequences, and now he was paying the price for it. The tall man motioned to the chair across from him. "Please, sit. We need to go over everything you've done." With shaky hands, the tourist moved from the uncomfortable wooden chair he had been sitting on to the other one. His legs felt weak beneath him, and he fought to keep his composure. He couldn't help but notice the stark difference between the way the man and the woman were acting compared to the guards. These two seemed far more official, and their expressions showed no sign of tolerance for mistakes. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before he spoke. "I didn't know," he began, his voice sounding smaller than he intended. "I didn't understand what I had done wrong. I thought it was just a light-hearted thing. I thought maybe it wouldn't matter." The man across from him leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing just a bit. "You were told, weren't you?" he asked, his tone not exactly harsh, but piercing. "You saw the guards standing in place. You saw them, and you chose to approach one. You thought it would be amusing to touch him, to make light of his position. You should have known better." The words stung. The tourist had been caught off guard by the seriousness of the situation. He hadn't been thinking about the guards' role in the country's history or how much respect they commanded. All he had seen was a chance to get a reaction, to make the moment memorable. But now, sitting in front of these two serious-looking officials, he could see just how wrong he had been. I didn't think it through," the tourist admitted. His voice was barely above a whisper now. He looked down at his hands, clasped tightly in his lap. It was hard to look them in the eye, not knowing what would happen next. He had no idea how severe the punishment for his actions might be. What would they do with him? Would they lock him up for years? Would they fine him? He had heard about strict laws in other countries, but he never imagined that something like this could happen so quickly, so easily. The shorter official, who had been standing quietly by the door, finally spoke. "The laws in this country are clear. When someone disrespects a royal guard, there must be consequences. You have broken that trust, and now we have to determine how to handle this." The tourist swallowed hard. It was as if his worst fears were being confirmed. The seriousness of the situation was sinking in, and there was no way to undo what had already happened. He couldn't take back the slap, couldn't erase the mistake he had made in that moment of impulse. He felt like an outsider, disconnected from the world around him. Everything felt foreign, even though he was in a place he had once thought was so fascinating. "Please," the tourist said, almost pleading. "I know I made a mistake, but I didn't mean any harm. I was just trying to have a good time, trying to make memories. I didn't realize how serious this was." The man who had been speaking to him regarded him for a moment before answering. "It's not about your intentions," he said calmly. "It's about understanding the seriousness of the position these guards hold. They represent more than just soldiers. They are symbols of the entire country's identity, its history, its pride. By disrespecting them, you have disrespected the people who hold them in high regard." The tourist sat back, absorbing the weight of the man's words. He hadn't realized the full significance of the guards before. To him, they were just part of the palace's charm, something to photograph and admire. But now he understood. These guards were so much more than that. They were not to be taken lightly, not to be used for amusement or as a photo opportunity. He sat in silence for a long moment, trying to process everything. The official continued speaking, outlining the seriousness of his offense. This is not something that can be overlooked. You've disrespected the very essence of this nation's pride. The punishment will be severe, but we will take your apology into account. The tourist nodded slowly, his mind spinning. He wasn't sure if his apology would make a difference, but he had no choice but to hope that somehow he could find a way out of this. All he wanted was to leave this room and never make the same mistake again. But he knew that the road ahead was uncertain, and the consequences were out of his hands. The tourist felt a chill run through him as the room fell silent once again. His hands were sweaty, his heart still racing. The man who had spoken to him about the guards, the country's history, and the seriousness of the situation had left the room, leaving him with only his thoughts for company. The longer he sat there, the more the reality of what had happened started to sink in. It had only been a simple mistake, a careless action born of impulsive curiosity. He never imagined that such a harmless gesture, a playful tap on the back of the guard, would have such serious consequences. But now he was beginning to understand the gravity of the offense. To the people of this country, the royal guards weren't just soldiers, they were symbols of strength, honor, and a deep respect for their heritage. He had broken an unwritten rule, one that many visitors, including himself, probably didn't fully comprehend. He tried to remember what he had been thinking in that moment, standing near the guard, excited to be so close to something so iconic. He had never meant to cause harm or disrespect. But even as he thought about it now, the consequences seemed to grow more real with every passing minute. He had crossed a line, and there was no way to go back. After what felt like hours, the door opened again. This time, it was the two officials who had been speaking to him earlier. They didn't say a word as they walked into the room, their expressions serious. The man with glasses moved to sit at the table, while the taller one stood near the door. The room had a tense atmosphere, and the tourist could feel his pulse quicken again. Every part of him was on edge. He was unsure of what would happen next. One of the men finally broke the silence. "We've spoken with the royal guard you touched," he said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "They are understandably upset by your actions. They see it as an insult, not just to themselves, but to the entire nation. This is not something that can be taken lightly." The tourist's stomach dropped at the mention of the guard's reaction. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. It had only been a momentary lapse in judgment, but now he was trapped in the consequences of it. He tried to gather his thoughts, but his mind was spinning. What could he say to make things right? Was there any chance for him to avoid the harsh punishment that seemed inevitable? "We've consulted with the legal authorities," the man continued, his gaze steady, "and the decision has been made." The tourist felt his breath catch in his throat. He hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't expected things to escalate this far. He had been hoping, even praying, that they would let him go with just a warning. But now it seemed as though his fate was sealed. "The law is clear," the man said, glancing down at the papers in front of him. "When someone disrespects the royal guards, there is no room for leniency. This is a violation of our nation's most sacred traditions, and as such, it carries a severe penalty." The tourist's hands clenched into fists, and he felt his heart race as the words sank in. He had heard stories about strict laws in foreign countries, but he never imagined that a simple act of disrespect could lead to something like this. His mind swirled with thoughts of what he could have done differently. Why hadn't he been more careful? Why hadn't he paid attention to the deeper meanings of the traditions that govern this place? However, the official continued, "We do recognize that your actions were not premeditated, nor were they malicious. You acted out of ignorance, not ill will. We will take this into account when determining your punishment." The tourist clung to those words, hoping against hope that there was some mercy in the decision. He didn't want to face the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. He had been so excited to experience a new culture, to explore a foreign land, and now it felt like his dream trip had turned into a nightmare. But there must be consequences, the official said. The law requires it. We cannot allow such actions to go unpunished, or it would undermine the values this country holds dear. The taller official stepped forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at the tourist. "We understand your position," he said, his voice measured but firm. "But the decision is out of our hands. The punishment has been decided." The tourist felt his chest tighten as the words he feared the most were finally spoken. "You will be sentenced to 5 years in prison," the man said, his voice unyielding. "This will give you time to reflect on your actions and the disrespect you've shown to our nation." The tourist could hardly believe what he was hearing. 5 years. 5 years for a mistake that had started out as a moment of curiosity and excitement. His mind went blank, the weight of the decision crushing him. How had things gotten so out of control? How had a simple misunderstanding escalated into a punishment so severe? "Your time here will be spent in confinement," the official continued. "You will be monitored, and during that time, we expect you to learn about our country's traditions, history, and the significance of the Royal Guards. You will have the opportunity to study and reflect on what has happened." For a moment, everything felt like a blur. The room, the officials, the palace, all of it seemed distant. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just been said. 5 years in prison. His thoughts turned to his family, his friends, his life back home. None of this had been part of the plan. None of it was supposed to happen. The officials stood, their expressions cold and final. "We'll arrange for your transport," the shorter official said. "You'll be taken to a facility where you'll begin serving your sentence immediately." The tourist nodded, his throat too tight to speak. There was nothing left to say. The decision had been made, and there was no way to change it. The weight of it all felt overwhelming, and he could only sit there in stunned silence, trying to absorb the gravity of what was happening. His trip had taken a tragic turn, and there was nothing he could do but accept the consequences and face the uncertainty of the days ahead. The tourist sat quietly in the dimly lit room, his thoughts spinning uncontrollably. The punishment was set. 5 years in prison. The words echoed in his mind like a constant drumbeat. He had heard the decision, felt the weight of it, but somehow it still didn't feel real. The room seemed too small, the walls too close, and the air too thick to breathe easily. He had come to this country to experience something new, to learn about a culture so different from his own. But now, he was trapped in a situation he never could have imagined. As he sat there, lost in thought, the door to the room opened. His mind snapped back to the present, and he looked up, instinctively trying to compose himself. 2 officers entered the room, their expressions just as serious as before. The man who had spoken to him about the law, the one with the glasses, stepped forward again. He didn't say anything immediately, but simply observed the tourist, his eyes studying him as if trying to gauge his reaction. After a moment, the official spoke. "I know this is difficult to accept, but the punishment has been decided. However, you should understand that this isn't just about punishment. This is about learning. Learning from your actions and understanding why they had such consequences." The tourist nodded slowly, his throat dry. What could he say? What could he do? He had already admitted his mistake, apologized, and now it was out of his hands. It seemed like no matter how much he tried to explain himself, it wouldn't change anything. He had broken an important rule in a culture he didn't fully understand, and now he was facing the repercussions. His mind wandered to his family and friends, wondering how they would react when they found out. How would they feel about him being locked away in a foreign prison for something so seemingly insignificant? "I understand," the tourist said quietly, though his voice cracked. He wanted to sound stronger, but the weight of the situation made it hard to keep up the facade. His voice faltered, but he forced himself to speak again. I didn't mean to offend anyone. I didn't realize how important this was to your people. I didn't understand the full meaning behind it." The official, to his surprise, nodded. "We understand that you acted out of ignorance, but there are still consequences. You've disrupted something that many people hold dear. The Royal Guards aren't just soldiers. They represent our history, our culture, and the strength of our nation. It's not something we can simply overlook." The tourist couldn't help but feel the sting of those words. He had seen the guards earlier, their stiff postures and serious expressions, but he had never understood what they symbolized. In his mind, they were just part of the grand display of the palace. He didn't realize they were a living part of the nation's pride, something that went far beyond the uniforms they wore or the stoic faces they showed the world. His small mistake, his lack of understanding, had turned into a monumental misstep. The official continued, his voice calm but unwavering. "You will be taken to a facility where you will have time to reflect on your actions. During this time, you'll also have the chance to learn more about our country's traditions and what they mean to us. You'll have access to books, lectures, and other resources to help you understand the significance of what you've done." The tourist could barely process the words. "Learn about your country's traditions," he repeated, his voice a little hoarse. What would that even mean? 5 years of reflection, learning about a culture he had only just started to explore. It felt like an eternity. He wanted to ask how long he would be in solitary confinement, or if he would be able to speak with anyone else, but he didn't know if the words would come out right. He didn't even know if he could face the kind of isolation he was about to endure. He had never imagined that one impulsive action would put him in such a position. The official seemed to sense his anxiety and gave him a slight nod. "We'll provide you with everything you need," he said. "We will ensure you understand the cultural importance of what you've done. But this is a time for you to reflect. A time for you to understand that actions, even small ones, can have far-reaching effects." The tourist didn't know what to say to that. How could he reflect on something he hadn't even fully understood in the first place? It was hard to find clarity in the overwhelming sea of confusion and regret that clouded his mind. He didn't want to stay in prison for 5 years, but he knew there was no way out of this. The decision had already been made, and there was nothing he could do but accept it. "Will I be able to contact my family?" he asked, his voice quieter now. He didn't expect any miracles, but a part of him hoped they would allow him some form of communication with the outside world. The official hesitated for a moment before answering. "You will be allowed to send letters, but you will not have unrestricted access to phones or email. Communication will be limited." The tourist's heart sank. He had never imagined being so isolated from everything and everyone he knew. 5 years in a foreign prison, cut off from his family and friends, with no easy way to reach out to them. He couldn't even begin to imagine what they would think when they learned about what had happened to him. The officials didn't say much more after that. They simply nodded, as though signaling that their part in the process was done. "You'll be escorted to the facility shortly. It's time to begin the process. We will see you through this, but remember, this is for your own good. This will be a learning experience." The tourist stood up slowly, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He felt like a shadow of his former self, lost, uncertain, and burdened by the knowledge that he would be spending the next several years locked away, reflecting on his mistake. As the officers led him out of the room, he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that settled in his chest. The future was uncertain, and all he could do now was take each day as it came. The days blurred together after the tourist was escorted to the facility. Everything felt so different from the excitement he had once felt when he arrived in the country. He had come here with hopes of exploring new places, learning about different cultures, and enjoying everything this foreign land had to offer. But now, as he sat in his cell, a deep sense of loss filled him. His life had taken a drastic turn, and the consequences of his actions seemed so much larger than he had ever anticipated. The facility was stark and quiet, much like the room where he had first been taken after the incident. The walls were gray, the floors were cold, and the air felt stale. There was no warmth, no comfort, just the hum of distant voices and the faint sound of doors opening and closing. He had been placed in a small private cell, and the only contact he had with the outside world came in the form of brief interactions with the guards and the occasional visit from the officials who had sentenced him. At first, the isolation was overwhelming. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything for long. His mind kept racing, replaying the moment when he had slapped the guard's back, the shocked look on the guard's face, and the consequences that followed. He wished he could go back in time, to undo that single moment. If he could just turn back the clock, maybe things would have been different. But now, there was no turning back. The tourist had plenty of time to reflect on his actions, and that's exactly what he did. He spent hours pacing the small cell, his thoughts tangled in regret and confusion. He had never imagined that such a minor lapse in judgment could have such a lasting impact. He had only meant to lighten the mood, to take a photo and share in the excitement of the moment. He hadn't realized that the guards were so much more than just symbols of the palace. They represented the very identity of the nation, and by disrespecting them, he had dishonored something sacred. There were moments when the tourist couldn't help but feel angry at himself. Why hadn't he understood the significance of what he was doing? Why hadn't he taken the time to learn about the culture before he arrived? It was all so clear now, but it was too late. The lessons he needed to learn were coming at a high price, one he wasn't sure he could ever fully pay. At times, he wondered if he would ever feel free again. He missed the simple pleasures of life, walking around freely, talking to strangers, enjoying the beauty of a new place. Now all of that seemed so far away. The confinement, the quiet, the uncertainty, it felt like a prison, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. The days passed slowly, and each one felt like a heavy burden. But there were also moments of clarity. In the silence of his cell, he had plenty of time to think, not just about his mistake, but about why it had happened. He realized that he hadn't fully appreciated the importance of understanding other cultures before he interacted with them. He had assumed that because he was a traveler, someone who visited many countries and learned about their histories, that he understood everything. But now he understood that there was so much more to learn, and much of it came from the respect he showed others. Slowly, the tourist began to settle into his new routine. Every morning, he was brought a small meal, and during the day, he was given a few hours to read and reflect on the materials provided to him. The officials had made it clear that the books and lessons were not just for punishment. They were meant to help him understand the culture he had disrespected. He read about the country's history, its royal family, and the role the royal guards played in maintaining national pride. The more he read, the more he began to appreciate the depth of the country's traditions and the reverence with which its people held their past. But understanding didn't come easily. Some of the lessons felt harsh, reminding him constantly of his mistake, of the consequences of his actions. There were times when the weight of it all seemed unbearable. But at other times, he found a strange sense of peace in the knowledge that he was slowly learning and growing, even if it was in a place he never imagined himself. The isolation gave him a chance to focus, to find the quiet he needed to reflect deeply on who he was and what he had done. As the weeks turned into months, the tourist's attitude slowly began to change. He stopped thinking only about his mistake and started focusing on how he could make the best of the situation. He still wished that he could take back what had happened, but he also realized that the only way to move forward was to embrace the lessons he was being taught. He started to see this time as an opportunity, a chance to change and grow, even if it came under the most difficult circumstances. He began to form a routine. Every morning, he woke up early, ready to dive into the books the officials had provided. He read about the culture, the customs, the people who had lived here for centuries. Each day, he learned something new. Each lesson helped him see the country in a different light. He had made a mistake, yes, But that didn't mean he couldn't become a better person because of it. He wasn't just being punished, he was being given a chance to change, to understand, and to make amends in a way that would last far beyond the time he spent in prison. The days continued to pass, and as they did, the tourist found himself becoming more at peace with his situation. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, or when he would be able to return home. But for the first time since his arrival at the facility, he felt like he had a purpose again. His time in prison had not been wasted. It had been difficult, yes, but it had also been a time of growth. He still had a long way to go, but he was no longer the same person he had been when he first entered the country. He had learned, and in that, he had found a sense of hope. The months had passed in a blur. Each day seemed to drag on for eternity, but the tourist had slowly come to terms with his situation. He had started to understand the importance of the lessons being taught to him. The isolation, though painful at first, had given him the space to reflect deeply on his actions. In those quiet moments, he had come to realize that there was a way forward, even in the face of such a harsh punishment. He had worked hard to understand the culture he had disrespected. At first, he had struggled with the materials the officials gave him, feeling frustrated by the constant reminder of his mistake. But over time, he began to find meaning in the words he read. He learned about the royal family's history, the traditions that had shaped the nation, and the deep respect the people had for their royal guards. The more he read, the more he appreciated just how important those traditions were, and how his careless actions had violated something much greater than just a simple gesture. As he spent more time learning, he also began to see his mistake from a different perspective. He had been so caught up in the excitement of his trip, so focused on what he wanted to experience, that he had failed to stop and consider the bigger picture. The guards, who had seemed like nothing more than a fascinating part of the palace at first, were much more than that. They were symbols of the nation's strength and identity, and his thoughtless action had been an offense to everything they stood for. Despite the loneliness that had initially gripped him, the tourist began to find a sense of peace in his new routine. The days still felt long, but they no longer felt pointless. He spent his time reading, reflecting, and slowly accepting the consequences of his actions. Each day, he learned something new, not just about the country, but about himself. He realized that while his actions had led to this harsh punishment, they had also given him the opportunity to change, to grow, and to become a better person than he had been when he first arrived. One morning, after finishing his daily reading, he sat quietly in his cell, reflecting on how far he had come. He had spent so many days thinking about the mistake he had made, but now he was beginning to focus on what he could do with the time that remained. The isolation that once felt like a punishment had become a chance to rediscover himself. He could have let this time break him, but instead, he had chosen to use it to rebuild his understanding of the world and the people around him. As the days passed, the tourist began to feel a sense of purpose that had eluded him before. The lessons had shaped him into someone more aware of the world around him, more conscious of the impact his actions could have on others. He thought about the people back home, his friends and family. He knew they wouldn't understand why he was there, but he hoped that when he returned, he would be able to show them the changes he had made. He hoped they would see that this experience, though difficult, had given him a new outlook on life. One day, several months into his sentence, the officials came to visit him again. This time, there was a sense of finality in their approach. The man who had spoken to him so many months ago looked at him carefully, as if assessing the changes he had undergone during his time in prison. "We've seen your progress," the official said, his voice measured. "You've put in the effort to learn and understand. You've accepted responsibility for your actions and made a conscious effort to change." The tourist felt a rush of emotions as he heard the words. He wasn't sure what the officials meant, but for the first time since he arrived at the facility, he felt like there was hope. He had worked hard to make things right, and now it seemed like that effort was finally being recognized. The official paused, then added, "Given your progress, we've decided to reduce your sentence. You've shown that you understand the significance of your actions and the importance of respecting our traditions. We believe that you've learned what you needed to learn." The tourist's heart skipped a beat. "So, does that mean I'm free to go?" he asked, unable to believe the words coming out of his mouth. The official nodded. "Yes, you'll be released soon. But remember, this experience isn't just about the time you've spent here. It's about how you carry the lessons with you into the future." The tourist couldn't contain the wave of relief that washed over him. He had spent so many days wondering how he could make amends for what he had done, and now, it seemed like he had been given a second chance. The sense of freedom, though bittersweet, filled him with gratitude. It wasn't just the release from prison that mattered. It was the understanding he had gained and the new perspective he had found. He had learned what it meant to truly respect other cultures, to understand their significance, and to appreciate their history. When the tourist left the facility, it was with a mixture of emotions. He felt free, yes, but he also felt changed. He had spent months reflecting on his actions, and the lessons he had learned would stay with him for the rest of his life. He knew that he would never forget the importance of respecting other cultures, of understanding that sometimes even small actions can have big consequences. As he made his way back home, he couldn't help but think of the experiences that awaited him. He would return to the world he had left behind, but he would do so with a new perspective, a greater understanding of the world, and a deep respect for the traditions and customs of the places he visited. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready to face it with the lessons he had learned, and the awareness that every step he took was an opportunity to grow and become a better person.